I think we'll begin, please. My name is Charles Anderson. I'm the president here at Augsburg and also a member of the advisory committee that has helped arrange this conference. From the vantage point of both of these positions, I'm pleased to welcome you to this place and to this event. It seems to me obvious that we have a problem. And if you did not believe that we face a crucial problem in the resurgence of bigotry and racism in the United States and also in the microcosms of the larger society which we find on college and university campuses, if you did not believe this, you would not be investing this May 4th, 1989, as you are. A year ago this month, the board of the Twin Cities Area Human Rights Coalition voted to help organize a statewide conference to address campus racism and bigotry. A member of that board, Morton Railway, whom you will meet in a moment, knew of my interest in the problem and approached me. And this event has come about through that initial action by the coalition and the response of many other persons. We're indebted to all of them. No one that I know would claim to have the answer to the questions before us. If he or she did, they would bottle it and make a fortune, or become a consultant and travel around full-time telling people exactly what we do, what to do. What we do have, however, is a common concern and a wealth of experience, some of it positive, and in some instances, some of it very negative. What we take away from this conference will depend in large measure on what we bring to it and what we are willing to share, if we are willing to share what we bring. And you are welcome and you are invited to active participation. I am pleased to present a friend and colleague, another member of the advisory committee, the president of the Minneapolis Community College, Earl Bowman.
I too would like to welcome you as a person, an educator of sorts, and particularly as a person of color. Because I believe that unless people make a concerted and bona fide effort and do so on a continuing basis, some of the social ills that we have, often referred to as racism, bigotry, etc., will get even worse than they are right now. And it was very encouraging when Dr. Anderson called me and asked if I would participate in an advisory capacity and possibly be a discussion leader to speak to some of these things, because I, like any number of other people, do not profess to have the capability, the intense effort, or we'll say energy that is needed to rectify any number of the things that we will be dealing with. But I do feel that through some, again, concerted effort, questioning, discussion, that there might be some light as to how to deal with these situations and hopefully to reduce the potential for them to get any worse than they are. And that is a hope, and I have the utmost confidence in the various intellectuals that are here that this will happen today. So again, I welcome you and look forward to some very interesting discussion throughout the day. I would like to in turn introduce Mr. Morton Railway, who is the Executive Director of the for Jewish Community Relations Council and the Anti-Defamation League of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Mr. Railway.
Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our lead-off speaker in a moment. I too want to welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. And I'm very proud that our agency, the Jewish Community Relations Council, Anti-Defamation League, is one of the co-sponsors of this event with the other groups that you see listed. It's almost sad that we need a meeting of this sort today, that there's a necessity to examine and combat and plan to work preventively against bigotry and racism on the campus. But unfortunately, that's the scene in America today, and that's the scene in Minnesota as well. We need to coordinate our efforts and be more aggressive. And we hope that today's meeting will be just the beginning of these efforts. And that when we all go back to our campuses, you will serve as a gadfly in your respective college and university community. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Divinio, who comes to us from Colgate University, where he's been in the psychology department since 1983 as a professor of psychology. From 1984 through 87, he headed the department. He's an educator, a researcher, and an author dealing mainly in race relations and bigotry and prejudice prevention. In 1985, he won the Gordon Allport Intergroup Relations Prize, which was awarded by the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues of the American Psychological Association for the best paper of the year on intergroup relations. He's also an author of many articles and co-author of several books. Several of the titles are Prejudiced, Discrimination and Racism, published in 1986, and Emergency Intervention and Power, Dominance, and Nonverbal Behavior. His topic is a very intriguing one. He's going to deal with racism among the well-intentioned of society. Dr. Dovidio, I'm very happy to introduce you.
Can you hear me okay? Good. I want to get the feedback in. Let me begin by just making a simple point. The point is that America is changing, and these changes are going to have profound impact on higher education. What are these changes? Well, first of all, the number of college-age students is dramatically declining. From the year 1980, and I think we'll have to lower the lights just a little bit for this, from the year 1980 to the year 2000, the number of college-age students will decline by 5 million or 11%. Second, the population of college-age students is becoming more diverse. Whereas overall there's going to be an 11% decline in the population, that decline will be 23% among white males. In the year 2000, 62% of the workforce will be women and minorities. And that proportion will be even greater in the 18 to 24-year-old group. In 1980, minorities comprised about 14% of the college-age population. In the year 2000, that figure will grow to be between 26 and 33%. So America is becoming dramatically more diverse, and particularly the college-age populations. Besides these demographic changes, there are other changes as well. Social unrest exists, and it's growing, and it's spreading. Over the past 2 years, there have been racial incidents at over 46 different college campuses. Actually, on the way here, I stopped at Oberlin, and I can add 47 different college campuses. It seems that every place I stop, there's another incident. In addition, racial unrest exists in our city's streets, and it is spreading and growing. In 1988, in New York City alone, there were over 375 documented racial incidents. And in January, Miami exploded because of racial tensions. People said it couldn't happen. People said it couldn't happen again, but it did in February and in Tampa. Now, the focus of my talk today is really on racial attitudes. So what I want to do now is talk about what racial attitudes have been, what they currently are, and what they seem to be becoming. And I want to alert you to the fact that I'm going to be focusing on the attitudes and behaviors of the majority group and not of minorities. And this is deliberate. It's not because I believe that minorities are free of bias and do not discriminate. They do discriminate and they do have biases. But it's because it's the majority group who possesses the resources and the ability, and if we possess the desire, we can produce significant positive change. In general, across time, the racial attitudes of white Americans to minorities, and blacks in particular, are becoming less negative and more positive. For example, as this survey will show, in 1933, 75% of the white respondents to this survey described blacks as lazy. By 1988, that figure declined to just 6%. In 1933, 38% of the white respondents to this survey described blacks as ignorant. And by 1988, that figure declined to just 6%, a dramatic change. The same pattern occurs if you look at nationwide Gallup poll results. The Gallup poll has asked the question repeatedly of white Americans to evaluate the ambitiousness of blacks relative to whites, to evaluate the intelligence of blacks relative to whites, to evaluate the inferiority of blacks relative to whites. And across time, there have been consistent changes. If you just follow these lines represent 1963 to 1978. Fewer whites than ever before in 1978 said that blacks were less ambitious than whites. Fewer whites than ever before in 1978 said that blacks were less intelligent than whites. And fewer whites than ever before in 1978 said that blacks were inferior to whites. So the good news is that things are getting better. But there's bad news here, and the bad news is obvious. In 1978, 25% of the white respondents described blacks as innately less intelligent than whites. And 15% openly said that blacks were inferior to whites. So although things are getting better, they're not all better. The same trends seem to occur when we talk about integration. On the next slide, I'm going to show you school integration on the left-hand side and residential integration on the right-hand side. And this is the result of nationwide polls. The higher the graph, the more positive the attitude towards integration. What we see here, again, is the same trend. The good news is that things are getting better. Things are getting much better. But the bad news was in 1982, 10% of the white population opposed school integration. 30 years after that became the law of the land. And 25% resisted residential integration, even though that's the law of the land. Things are getting better, but not all better. White Americans are also becoming more accepting of black leaders. The Gallup organization has repeatedly asked the same question to white American voters. Would you be willing to vote for a well-qualified black presidential candidate? And that'll be the red line on the next graph. In 1958, the majority of Americans, white Americans, said no to this question. Whereas in 1984, 85% of the white respondents said they would be willing to vote for a well-qualified black presidential candidate. Again, some good news. Of course, the bad news is that 15% of them said that they would not vote for a well-qualified presidential candidate simply because that person was black. Which to me is kind of ironic. I've been looking for years to find a well-qualified presidential candidate. Interracial marriage. It turns out in the late 1960s, about 25% of the white population opposed interracial marriage. In 1984, over 50% of white Americans were accepting of interracial marriage. So across a wide variety of surveys, we get a consistent pattern of results. Things are getting better, but they're not all better. Things are getting consistently better, but 15 to 20% of the white population still endorse and still express the old-fashioned redneck type of racism. Now, ironically, although the focus of my talk is on racism, I'm not going to be talking about this 15 to 20% of the population. And it's not because I believe that this group doesn't have a significant negative impact on the quality of life of blacks. They certainly do. But they're a straightforward group, they're a well-researched group, and they're a well-understood group. They say what they mean, and they mean what they say. This is also the group that you are well equipped to deal with. You have the mechanisms in place, you have the experience, there's a little that I can add today. What I am going to focus on is this 15 to 20% of the white population who say they're not prejudiced, who may truly believe they're not prejudiced, but who nonetheless may be exhibiting a modern, subtle form of bias. And that'll be the focus of my talk. I'm going to take you through a a model of racism with respect to blacks. Later on in questions we can talk about it with respect to other groups. Now I believe that the existence of the subtle form of racism helps account for the persistence of discrimination in American society today. In a 1988 Gallup poll, 25% of the black respondents said that they believed that white people want to hold black people down. And 44% of all the respondents to that survey said that society is holding black people down. In addition, despite the consistent increase in positive racial attitudes across time, racial disparities in the quality of life have not shown the same trend. I'm going to show you a slide in a minute of 3 indices of quality of life. The first one is infant mortality. The second one is unemployment, and the third one is poverty level. You see that a ratio of 1 would indicate equality in the rates between blacks and whites. If you look at the left, infant mortality. Infant mortality for blacks has been typically twice the rate for whites, and things are no better in 1982 than they were in 1949. Unemployment for blacks relative to whites has been 2 to 3 times the rate, and things were no better in 1982 than they were in 1949. In fact, somewhat worse. In terms of the rate of poverty, blacks have typically had a rate of 3 times the rate of whites. Things are getting a little bit better, but the rate maintains 3 to 1. So despite the positive increase in racial attitudes that we've seen, the quality of life for blacks has not improved in a corresponding fashion. And I believe that's because of the existence of this modern subtle form of racism, the racism among the well-intentioned. Well, what is the nature of this modern subtle form of racism? Well, in trying to answer this question, I began at the beginning. I tried to develop a list of psychological theories and explanations that help explain why people would be likely to develop prejudice in the first place, why people would be biased. And as I developed this list for a paper I was writing, I was struck by a number of things. First of all, the list is quite long, and I'm going to show you just a portion of that list because it won't fit on one slide. Second of all, the processes involved were not psychopathological processes, but they were normal processes. They were processes that normal people engage in, and they seemingly adaptive. Third of all, these factors and these processes fall into 3 categories. Cognitive, which deals with the way people think. Motivational, which deals with the fact that people have basic needs and try to satisfy those needs. And socio-cultural, which deals with the fact that we grow up in a society and we adopt the values of that society. Here are some of the examples. Cognitive. I'll just give you a couple of examples, 1 or 2 examples of each. Cognitive deals with the way people think. What psychologists have found, this is consistent cross-culturally, across a wide number of societies, if you simply and arbitrarily define people into groups. If I say you were group A and you were group B, that automatically initiates bias. People begin to evaluate other people in their group more highly, and they begin to devalue people in the other group. This is an automatic process. And it happens even though you may never meet another person in your group, or you may never meet another person in the other group. This is an automatic, normal process. Secondly, if we lay on top of this idea of valuing the in-group more than the out-group, we also have to notice that within our society, within our culture, there are different inherent associations with even the colors, black and white. When you think of what some of the associations we have with white, traditionally, white stands for what? Goodness, purity, light, and black stands for badness, evil, death. As I read my children Grimm's fairy tale, I'm struck by, in these fairy tales, who is good? Snow White. What can be whiter than snow? And who is bad? The witch, and the witch always dresses in black. These are very pervasive types of associations we have in our society. One person even pointed out that it even relates to food. And I was stunned by that. What do you mean it relates to food? But they pointed out, what is that kind of dark chocolate cake? Devil's food cake. And what's that white fluffy cake? Angel food cake. So what we have in here is even implicit in the labels that we give things, that black is bad and white is good. So if we lay that on top of the simple in-group, out-group categorization, we have a different value in the 2 groups without any motive to do harm, without any motive to be biased. Now, on top of that, we do have motives. And we have motives for self-esteem, control, and status. Not simply for ourselves, but for our groups. And in a world of limited resources, one of the ways we maintain our status and our control is by resisting the progress of other groups. It's by keeping other groups down. And this is a normal motivational process. Sociocultural, and that deals with the fact that we adopt the values of our society. We have to admit and we have to recognize that America has racist traditions. We were founded on the principle that all men are created equal. But it took us almost 200 years to pass legislation guaranteeing that blacks are equal to whites. And we were never able to pass legislation saying that women are equal to men. The mass media. If you look at the mass media, we see that blacks are underrepresented in the mass media, on TV, for example, and are depicted in less positive ways than whites. In fact, I mean, it astounds me, here's another little bit of trivia for you, that it was only in the mid to late 1960s that a black first starred in a primetime TV drama. Anybody? No, this is actually a Trivial Pursuit question, so it may come in handy someday. It was what? No, it was Bill Cosby in the late 1960s, and the TV show was I Spy. But that's right, that was only about 20 years ago when we could see a black person star in primetime TV dramas. That to me is astounding. And we still see a bias in the portrayals in the mass media. We also, if you just think about it, if you look around you and you ask who occupies positions of power, status, prestige, and control in our society, what you'll see is it is disproportionately white males. And that sends a message to people of all colors and both sexes about what is valued in our society. What is valued in our society is white and male, and that's the message that we get bombarded with daily. So these are all reasons why people would be likely to develop bias, and these are all normal fundamental processes. What about reasons why people would not be prejudiced? Well, I tried to develop a list of those reasons too, and I was struck by a couple of things there. First of all, the list was very short. So short I'm not even going to put it up. Second of all, the principles involved were not these fundamental psychological principles, but they were instead abstract, complex principles of fairness, justice, and morality. They weren't the same level of basic fundamental processes, but they were indeed more abstract. So now, looking at this question about why people would be prejudiced and why they would be prejudiced, when someone comes to me and tells me that they're prejudiced, I believe them. I can understand why. I see lots of reasons why. However, when someone comes to me and says that they are not prejudiced, what they're implying to me and perhaps to themselves is that they have been able to overcome all these normal processes, these normal psychological processes, and are relying solely on these abstract principles of fairness, justice, and equality. That to me is more interesting. That to me is the focus of my research. Now, in the remainder of this talk, what I'm going to try to do is take you through some research, and try to bear with me. I'm a research psychologist, and data is really the business that I'm in. But I want to use this to present a story to you, to document a story to you. It's not opinion. These are the data. There's first of all, the contemporary attitudes are complex and conflicted. Second of all, that bias is expressed in subtle, indirect, and rationalizable ways among modern racists. Third of all, that people will not say negative things about blacks. People will not say that blacks are inferior. But what persists in America today is the belief of white superiority. Despite the denial of these negative feelings, they do exist, even though we may not be aware of it. And finally, I'll try to make an argument that more bias is expressed not to low status blacks, but actually to higher status blacks, at least within the realm of the college, of the university. Now basically, what we propose is this. When people say they're not prejudiced, I believe they truly believe that they're not prejudiced, that they truly endorse these values of fairness and justice. But on the other hand, because we are normal people, because we have grown up in our society, we still have these negative feelings. But we may not be aware of it. We will not acknowledge those negative feelings. We reject those negative feelings. So what we have existing side by side within us are the values of fairness and justice and egalitarianism. But existing side by side with that are negative feelings and beliefs about blacks and other minorities. This creates psychological tension within the individual. This creates behavioral instability. within the individual. And what happens is some of the times you get the positive behaviors, some of the times you get the negative behaviors. But what we believe, what determines whether the behavior will be positive or negative is the nature of the situation. And here's basically the framework. The red line, you can't see what it says, but trust me, it says towards blacks. And that would be the convention I'll use. The yellow line represents whites, and the red line represents blacks. Basically, our assumption, our framework is this. Because we believe modern racists, and that's the term I'm going to use from now on, modern racists are people who truly believe they're not prejudiced, who truly endorse values of fairness and justice, but who have these negative failings because of these normal psychological processes. Because modern racists truly want to be fair, just, and egalitarian, truly want to be good, they will not discriminate against a black person when discrimination would be obvious and easily recognized by other people and oneself as racial bigotry. So in situations where right and wrong is clearly defined, in situations where norms for appropriate behavior are clearly defined, modern racists will not discriminate, because discrimination would challenge their egalitarian self-image and make them appear bigoted to other people. Modern racists are not bad people, and they want to be good. However, because modern racists have these negative feelings will be expressed, but they'll be expressed in subtle, indirect, and rationalizable ways. They'll be expressed in situations when right and wrong is not clearly defined. They'll be expressed in situations when norms for appropriate behavior are not clearly defined. They'll be expressed in situations where a person can make a negative response, but can justify or rationalize that response on the basis of some factor other than race. That allows a person to discriminate, that allows a person to disadvantage a minority group and advantage the majority group, and yet insulates us from ever having to believe that race is the cause. Because we always have some other explanation, and we never behave inappropriately. All that framework okay? Any questions? Let me try to make it clear with an illustration. In the first test of this framework, we tried to take advantage of a naturally occurring event and model it in the laboratory. The naturally occurring event was the Kitty Genovese incident. Many of you may be familiar with it. I'll remind you. Kitty Genovese was returning home from work late one night in 1964 in New York City. As she entered the parking lot of her building, a man drove up, got out of his car, and began to stab her. She screamed for help. Lights went on in her apartment building. The assailant became afraid, got in his car, and drove away. He didn't drive away very far, across the street to watch what happened. What happened was no one came to her aid. So he came back a second time, got out of his car, and continued to stab Kitty Genovese. She screamed again for help. Lights went on again. No one came to her aid. But the man got afraid and drove away a second time. By now, Kitty Genovese was crawling to the front door of her building. She was trying to get in. He came back a third time, finished the job, and killed her, got in his car, and drove away. Now, we know so much about that event because when the police arrived a few minutes later, they found out that there were 38 people who witnessed that event from beginning to end. That incident, which was really 3 separate incidents across a 45-minute period, 38 people witnessed that event. Not one person intervened, and not one person called the police. How could this happen? Well, psychologists have come up with an explanation that concerns personal responsibility. When you are the only witness to an emergency, you bear 100% of the responsibility for helping and 100% of the guilt and blame for not helping. What's appropriate behavior in that situation is clearly defined, and you do it, you help. However, if you simply believe that somebody else is present and that these other people can help, or will help, or already has helped, then personal responsibility is less clear. Because if you come to believe that somebody else will intervene or has intervened, then you don't have to help, and you're not letting that person suffer and die. Okay, of course, if everybody believes that somebody else will help or has helped, what will happen? Nobody will help, and Kitty Genovese will die. And that's what happened. That's called diffusion of responsibility. Well, what we did was we tried to take the situation and model it in the laboratory and look to see how race affected these results. Essentially, what we did was we brought subjects into the laboratory. All the subjects were white. We told them that they were going to be performing an Esp experiment. Esp is a great story to tell subjects because everybody thinks they have a little bit of Esp. So everybody's very eager to participate. And what we told them is they would be trying to receive Esp messages from Brenda Evans, who was in the room next door and could communicate to them over an intercom system. What we did with half our subjects was lead them to believe that they were the only person in the building with Brenda, and Brenda was going to become the victim. For the other half of the subjects, we led them to believe that there were 2 other people also trying to receive the ESP messages. What we did was we showed them 2 ID cards and said, here's the other people. Actually, they were just ID cards, no one else was present, and those 2 other people were also white. In half the cases, we led the subject to believe that Brenda Evans was white, and the other half of the cases, we led them to believe that Brenda Evans was black. And we did that again by showing them the ID card. Do you know this person? No. Take a good look? No. Okay. We put that down, and then partway through the experiment over the intercom system, Brenda said she had to straighten some things out before they went on. All of a sudden, there was a loud crash. There were screams for help. Some more screams for help. Scream, scream, scream. She screamed a lot. And then all of a sudden, there was a thud and silence for 6 minutes. And the question was, would people help in the situation, and would they help with the function of the race of the victim? Now, what we predicted was that when people were the only witness, what's right and wrong is clearly defined. What's appropriate behavior is clearly defined, and our subjects who we described as modern racists, we believed would not discriminate against a black person, because to discriminate in that situation could easily be interpreted by other people and to oneself as being bigoted. In fact, what we expected was that people might even help the black victim more than the white victim as a way of reasserting or reaffirming the self-image of being non-prejudiced and egalitarian. So in that case, we predicted there would be no discrimination. However, we expected that the nature of the situation would determine whether or not discrimination occurs, and we believe that when people had the opportunity to diffuse responsibility, when they had the opportunity to come to believe that somebody else could intervene or would intervene or had intervened, and therefore relieve themselves of personal responsibility, relieve themselves of having to become involved in that situation, they would take that explanation, but they would do so more when the victim was black than when the victim was white. So that we expected the bias would occur in the situation where you could justify non-involvement, but you could justify it on the basis of some factor that has absolutely nothing to do with race. Well, here are the results of the study. And not surprisingly, after that long introduction I just objected to you, the results confirm the predictions. Well, why would I do that? In the alone condition, first of all, you should notice that people help a lot. They help 83 to 95% of the time. So when people are the only witness to an emergency, they do help. They're not apathetic. They do the right behavior. And they do so as much to the black victim as the white victim. They help the black victim 95% of the time. They help the white victim 83% of the time. However, if you give people simply the opportunity to believe that somebody else can help or will help, it does have an effect. It does reduce helping behavior. It does reduce intervention, but mainly for the black victim. In this case, when people simply believe that somebody else would help, they help the black victim only 37.5% of the time. They help the white victim twice as often in this situation, 75% of the time. If this situation were real, the black victim would die 62.5% of the time. If this situation were real, the white victim would die 25% of the time. So what we have here is the nature of the situation determines whether or not bias will be expressed. And what's interesting is I interviewed each and every one of these people who didn't help. And I asked them, why didn't you help? And the answer was always the same. Because I thought somebody else would do it, or I thought somebody else had done it. And I would try to push people about whether race was an issue. I would ask them some questions that would prod them, was race an issue? And people went at great lengths to deny that race could be an issue. In fact, they went so far as I would try to get them to tell me something about Brenda Evans. Not one subject ever volunteered the information that they recognized that Brenda Evans was black. I would say things like, describe her to me. And if they kind of curly hair, I said, tell me something else about her. They could tell me her birthday, her social security number, what dormitory she lived in, but no one would spontaneously offer me the information that she was black. And when I raised that question, they would say, oh yeah, I think I noticed that, but that had nothing to do with my decision. Well, they're in a situation where they may truly believe that race had nothing to do with their decision. But by the nature of the situation we create, we know that race had something to do with their decision. That race was a factor, but it operated indirectly and subtly in a way that insulated people from ever having to believe that they might be biased. Follow that? Now what I want to also point out here is that this is kind of dramatic, experimental illustration of this kind of modern racism. that I know quite a bit about because it involved me. A couple of weeks ago when I was preparing for this presentation, I needed to get a book out of the library. And I was pretty sure that I knew exactly where it was. So I went running into the library, turned down the aisle where the book was, took 2 steps, saw somebody in the aisle, automatically turned around, went down another aisle where incidentally there was another person. And while I was down in the second aisle, I began to come up with explanations about why I was in the second aisle. I began to say to myself, well, gee, I think maybe the book is in this aisle, not the first aisle. Then I came up with another explanation. I said, well, all these aisles look like I think I was mistaken before. I came up with a third explanation. The light's better in this aisle. I came up with a fourth explanation and a fifth explanation. Then a couple of things occurred to me. First of all, I was in a rush. Why was I wasting time coming up with 5 explanations why I was in the second aisle? That seems pretty trivial. The second thing I realized is all 5 explanations had nothing to do with race. And the third thing I realized was the person in that first aisle was black, and the person in the second aisle where I was standing was white. And I reflected upon what happened. What happened was, when I turned down that aisle, I saw a black man. And I began to feel some anxiety and discomfort. And so I quickly disengaged from that situation to find a situation that was more comfortable. I automatically turned around, escaped from that situation, and went down the second aisle where there was another white person, and I felt comfortable. And then what I had to do was, because I'm a good, fair, and just person, I had to justify that behavior and explain that race had nothing to do with my decision, and hence I came up with 5 different explanations. Well, what I exhibited there, what I would call, would be the symptoms of modern racism. And the symptoms of modern racism would be: first of all, modern racists do have a sincere commitment to equality. I'm here today because I have a sincere commitment to equality. Second of all, because modern racists have negative feelings towards blacks, we tend to avoid interracial interaction. Because when we're involved in interracial interactions, we experience anxiety and discomfort. Now, some of that anxiety comes from interacting with someone who is different from us. But some of that anxiety comes from the fact that we are afraid of disclosing to other people and ourselves that we might be biased. So as a consequence, when we are in an interracial situation that we cannot escape, we are worried about appearing biased, so we tend to strictly adhere to recognize rules or codes of behavior. By staying close to those rules, I won't do anything wrong. And therefore, I'll never have to face the possibility that I might be prejudiced. And finally, because modern racists do have negative feelings, these negative feelings get expressed but in subtle, indirect, and rationalizable ways. By the way, I now have a basic rule of thumb. Now, when I'm in an interracial situation, and I find that I have to come up with around my third non-race-related explanation about why I did what I did. When I get up around 3, 4, or 5, I stop myself and confront myself and say, well, maybe race is the issue here. But it's a very easy thing to do. We automatically dismiss race as an explanation and come up with others. Now, I believe that the existence of this modern form of racism has implications for the way racial attitudes are assessed and the way those data are interpreted. If we ask somebody, right out, do you support integration? Well, the right answer is obvious to people. To say anything but yes could easily be interpreted as being bigoted and prejudiced. If I ask people, would you be willing to vote for a well-qualified black presidential candidate? The right answer is obvious. To say anything but yes would make you an overt racist. So as a consequence, what I believe is that these nationwide surveys overestimate the amount of racial tolerance in America today. The right answer is obvious. People want to give the right answer, they want to do the right thing, and so they overestimate racial tolerance. Well, what I try to do is investigate, in some study I'm talking about here, how modern racism relates to the way prejudice is expressed. And in some of the earlier research that I was doing, what I would do is ask people on 1 to 7 scales to rate how good or bad a white person is. Rate how good or bad on a 1 to 7 scale a black person is. Rate on a 1 to 7 scale how kind or cruel a white or black person is. And while I was doing this research, I was finding that my subjects were not discriminating between black and white on those ratings. In a way that was kind of troubling to me, because I knew racism existed on campus. Everybody knew racism existed on campus, and I couldn't find it. Of course, it's also particularly troubling for me, because actually, when you think about it, racism is my business. If there's no racism, I'm out of a job. So that really motivated me to look around more carefully. And what I noticed was that there was a real compression of responses. Everybody avoided the negative end. Everybody avoided saying something bad, particularly about a black person. So everything was compressed to the positive end, and as a consequence, I wasn't getting any differences. So I did a minor change in the procedure. What I did was I asked people not to rate a black person from how good or bad, but I asked them to rate how good a black person is, how good a white person is, how bad a black person is, how bad a white person is. So I broke the scale into two different parts. And then when I looked at the results, they were more interesting and more provocative. Here are the results. I'll try to describe this if you can't see it well. The left-hand bars refer to how people rated blacks and whites on negative traits. The higher the bar, the more associated. On that left-hand side, what you see is our subjects did not associate more negative characteristics with blacks than with whites. There was no discrimination here. To say a black person is bad could easily be interpreted as being prejudiced and bigoted. So people did not say that blacks were worse than whites. No bias there. But if we look at the right-hand side, if we look at the positive traits, how good is a white person? How good is a black person? How kind is a white person? How kind is a black person? Bias does indeed occur. It's not that people say that blacks are worse than whites. But what our subjects say is that whites are better than blacks. Kind of asymmetric here. It's not that blacks are more bad than good. Blacks are quite good. But what comes out here is that blacks are good, but whites are even better. It's not the idea of black inferiority. But what persists here is a belief in white superiority. And it's a way that comes out subtly and indirectly and does not appear to be obviously bigoted, but is a modern subtle bias just the same. Now, when you look at what people say, that's one thing. What do people really think? Are they just trying to do this as a show for me? So what we tried to do in other studies was try to figure out what people are actually thinking. And we tried to use some methods of cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology says that if two events are associated in your mind, you can make decisions about them more quickly. So we asked people to make some decisions for us. The important decisions are made in a split second. And what we believe is that if people have biased attitudes, then their decisions will be biased as well. Here's an example of what happens in cognitive psychology. Let's take the top example here. So remember, cognitive psychologists look at the way people think and the way people make decisions. What Roche did in a classic study was ask people to think about a category. I'm going to go along. So think of the category of bird for a minute. Just try to visualize the bird in your mind. Got it? Okay. Now the task is, do the next two words belong to the category of bird? Okay. Bird, ready? Apple, orange. No. Okay, that was an easy one. Bird, robin, sparrow. Yeah, okay. Bird, kumquat, cantaloupe. No. Bird, ostrich, pelican. The answer is yes, but it took you longer. Did you notice that? Okay? The idea is that in your mind, when you're thinking of a bird, most of you had an image of a robin, a sparrow, or a blue jay. I doubt any of you had an image of an ostrich or a pelican. Actually, if you did, don't admit it, okay? So what we argue here is that people have an image, a stereotype of what a bird is, and therefore they can make decisions about things that are closely related to that image. What we asked was, I want you to think of the category white or black, meaning white people or black people. Think about whites and blacks. Now, here's the decision we want you to make. Can good ever describe a white person? The answer is yes. Can good ever describe a black person? Yes. Can bad ever describe a white person? Yeah. Can bad ever describe a black person? So what we're looking at was not whether people said yes, we expected them to say yes all the time, but the question was how fast did it take them to make that decision? And that's a measure of what people are actually thinking. Well, when we look at the decision, reaction time, remember the faster the reaction time, the more quickly people respond, the more associated these are in people's minds. And we're talking here about split-second decisions. We're talking about decisions being made in literally less than a second. Well, what we find here is convergent evidence. If you look in the right-hand panel, what we see here is that people do not associate more negative characteristics with blacks than with whites. they're not thinking more negative things about blacks than about whites. But what we do find again is people associate more positive characteristics with whites than with blacks. It's not that blacks are bad, it's simply that whites are better. It's not that blacks are inferior, but what persists here is a belief of white superiority. And this affects people's decision making in literally a half a second, very automatic type responses. Now, one of our assumptions has been that modern races have these negative feelings, but what we do is we deny them, we reject them, we censor them so that we're never aware that we have them. Is there any way to see if we can find these negative feelings below the level of awareness, below what we're conscious of? And it turns out we've come up with some new techniques that help us really find out what people think and believe, even though they may not be aware of it. This is kind of goes back to the idea of subliminal perception. If you know that term. It's come back, but it's come back in a more dignified way. Basically, I'll give you what we do. What we do in this study is we present the word black or white. We never tell people the study is about race, but we present the word black or white very, very quickly. It registers. We have evidence that it registers on people, but they're not aware that they've seen it. Then what we do is we quickly cover that word up with a bunch of letters P. P stands for a person. And then what we do is we ask them, does the next word good? Can that word ever describe a person? Can bad ever describe a person? But what people actually are registering is white person, a black person, even though they're never aware that they've seen the word white or black. You follow that? What we find here is when we do this in a way that people are not even conscious of, what we find out is that on the positive traits we get the same effect that we always get. People have more positive associations with whites than with blacks. White subjects have more positive associations with whites than with blacks, but now for the very first time, if we can go to the level of awareness, if we can go to the point that people cannot censor their response, what we find out is the negative associations are there, but they're there below the level of awareness. So we have direct evidence that it's there, but not at the level of awareness. Now, one of the arguments we've been making is that some of the reasons that people are biased are based on normal processes. And one of these normal processes is the categorization of people into in-group and out-group, so we's and they. So we ran this study over again one other time, and instead of using the subliminal prime, white or black, we used the subliminal primes, we and they, and tried to see if we and they would produce similar effects. Again, our assumption is that bias is not based on psychopathological processes, but the normal processes that people engage in. Here's the results for we and they. Looks very similar. And what happens is people have more positive associations with we and more negative associations with they. Now, I'm not trying to say that all racism can be reduced to a we-they distinction. It's much more deeper than that. It's much more complicated than that. But I do want to make the point again is that I believe that modern racism is based on normal processes that are difficult to avoid and that most people are susceptible to. Now, what we move to, prejudice is bad, but it wouldn't be so bad if these ideas just stayed in people's heads. As long as they don't affect behavior, we can live with it. The question we asked next was, do these attitudes get expressed in behavior? And the point was we believe that attitudes affect the way people think, and the decisions that people make, and these decisions affect the way people behave. So in the next short series of studies, I just want to bring you back to the idea of behavior and how this gets expressed. Basically, what we tried to do is find a situation that had consequence to our students. And what we did is we recruited them to assist us in the admissions of potential students to Colgate University. We tried to bring them into the process. And what we did was we gave them information, transcript information about candidates who were applying to Colgate. Actually, they were fictitious candidates. The transcript represented either someone who was very poorly qualified for admission, someone who was moderately qualified for admission, and someone who was extremely well qualified for admission. They read the transcript information, and all we did was attach a picture of a black or white person to that transcript. Then we asked them to evaluate these different candidates. Well, first of all, if we look at how white subjects evaluated the black candidates, what you'll see here is the higher the score, the higher the evaluation. People do not show an old-fashioned type of racism where they say blacks can't be good. They could easily recognize that the low ability will black was more qualified than the moderate ability, and the moderate ability was less qualified than the moderate ability, and the highly qualified black was the most qualified of all. So what they do is they recognize that black would be qualified, but of course that's not how you test for discrimination. You test by comparing how our subjects rated the white and applicant with exactly the same qualifications. Moving from left to right. Again, the lighter graph represents whites, the darker graph represents blacks. If you look at for the applicants with weak qualifications, people did not rate blacks lower than whites. In fact, they rated the black applicant slightly higher than the white applicant. No discrimination against blacks there. As you move to the moderate level, there's a shift. People rated the black applicant slightly less well than the white applicant. If you move to the high ability, the highly qualified applicant, what we find out is we get a significant difference. Although the highly qualified black applicant is good, the highly qualified white applicant with exactly the same credentials is significantly better. It's the same idea. It's not that blacks are worse than whites. You don't get the bias at the low end, but what you do is you get the bias at the high end. Blacks can be good, they can be quite good, but they're not as good as whites. You follow that? The other point I want to make here, and I'm going to extrapolate a little bit from the data, if you think about the implications of this decision, where are the greatest implications? Is that weak applicant ever going to get into Colgate? No, so there's no real consequence to your decision. It's easy, it's cheap. It's very easy to be non-prejudiced in that situation. It has no consequence. As you move to the moderate ability, the consequence, the implications become greater. And as you move to the strongly qualified applicant, that's when that person really has a chance of getting in, and that's when you get the bias. Now, we even have some additional evidence I want to point out here that relates to how people respond to blacks and whites in an actual high status or low status situation, where we actually presented them with a black or a white person, and we varied the status of the black or the white person. What we did in this study, this next study, was introduce subjects to an experiment where they were going to be working on with a partner. We told subjects that they had scored average on an intelligence test at the beginning of the semester, and then we varied the status of their partner. In half the cases we said, your partner scored in the top 20% of this intelligence test. Your partner is very bright, and your partner is going to be your supervisor. That's the high status situation. In the low status situation, subjects were told they were average in intelligence. And then we told them that your partner scored in the bottom 20%, and that partner would be your subordinate. That's the low status situation. We tried to get a measure of how people would respond, positively they would respond. So what we did was we staged an incidental helping situation with a partner actually prepared to knock some things over, and we measured whether or not the subject spontaneously offered assistance. Now, our predictions were, based on a lot of research, that people value high status and ability, at least among whites. That people value high ability more than low ability, people value high status more than low status, at least among whites, and therefore our subject should be more helpful to the high status white person than to the low status white person. Then we wanted to ask what would occur when the partner was black. Well, here are the results. Do you get the same effect? Well, looking at the results for the yellow line, what we see here is that people are indeed more helpful to the high status white person than to the low status white person. Status is a positively valued characteristic when that is a characteristic of a white person. But what we find here, in contrast to the black, is that the high status black person receives less help than the low status black. So what's a positively valued characteristic for whites is negatively valued for blacks. Subjects help the high status black less than they help the high status white. Now again, this is not the old-fashioned form of discrimination. It's not that they just wouldn't help black people. In fact, the person who was helped the most in this study was a black person. But what black person? It was the low ability, low status black person. Subjects were very willing to help a black person. But what kind of black person? The black person in his place. But as that person began to gain status, as that person began to gain ability, that person was apparently threatening to the traditional status that white Americans are used to, and therefore we get a negative response to that person. Whereas, again, what's a positive characteristic for whites turns out to be a negative characteristic for blacks. Now, how can people justify this kind of negative response, relatively negative response to a black high status person? Well, we tried to look at this a little bit more carefully. We also asked subjects in this study to evaluate how intelligent they were. Remember, we told subjects that they were average in intelligence. Then we asked them to evaluate the intelligence of their partner. Well, then we took a different score. A positive score would indicate that you think your partner is more intelligent than you. A negative score would indicate that you think your partner is less intelligent than you. Here's the results of the high and low ability black and white. The 0 point, which is the second line from the top there, would represent judging your partner as equal in intelligence to you. If we move from left to right with the yellow line, what we see is that subjects evaluated their high ability white partner as somewhat more intelligent than themselves. They could accept the fact that a white person could be more intelligent than themselves. They evaluated the low ability white partner as significantly less intelligent than themselves. They could accept that. They evaluated the low ability black partner as significantly less intelligent than themselves, and there was no discrimination at the low end. But as we move to the high end, I want you to notice two things. Subjects describe the high ability black partner as more intelligent than the low ability black partner, but is significantly less intelligent than the high ability white partner. Again, the bias occurs at the positive end, not at the negative end. This high ability black can be good, but he's not as good as the white. In addition, subjects who were told that they were average in intelligence, who could accept the fact that a white person could be more intelligent than them, these subjects described the high ability black person as significantly less intelligent than themselves. Although they could accept the fact that a white person could be smarter than them, they could not accept the fact that even a black person, a highly qualified black person, could be even equal in intelligence to themselves. Now think of the implications here. If I misperceive the competence of blacks so that I always perceive that they are less intelligent than me, any time that I am competing for a job or admission to medical school or any value status, any time that black person gets that job over me, I will resist that. I will respond negatively to that. And why? If you ask me, does race have anything to do with it? I will say, no. Why am I resisting it? Because obviously a less qualified person is getting advantage status over me, a more qualified person. Race has nothing to do with it. It's relative competence, and I am more competent than that person. Does race have something to do with it? Yes, it is race that determines this misperception. So what happens is I will resist these programs, not on the basis of race, I believe, but on the basis of less qualified people are getting advantage status over more qualified people. But really, race is the issue, because race determines my perceptions, even though I'm not even aware of it. Follow that? Now, people ask me, what happens if you run this study, not with black and white male partners? What if you run the same study with a white male partner and a white female partner? So I'll just give you the healthy behavior portion of that. I wish someone would ask me that, but I'll assume you did. Here are the results. Now, I want to point out the results again. The white line represents white males, and the red line this time represents white females. Again, what is a positively valued characteristic for men turns out to be a negatively valued characteristic for women. The person who has helped the most in the study is indeed a woman, but is a woman in her place. But as her status increases, as her ability increases, the helping decreases. The response becomes more negative because it violates the traditional role status that white males in society are used to, and which coincidentally advantages us. So there's a negative response. Now, let's try to bring this to a conclusion here. What I try to do is take you to a model. And the model is focused on race. I mean, I try to elaborate the model with one particular racial group. We do have some evidence that this does extrapolate to other groups, although not a great deal. But one of the questions that comes up repeatedly is, okay, we've got the problem, what do we do about it? Okay, and that's a very difficult problem, because what I've been trying to convince you is that this modern racism is subtle, it's indirect, it's elusive, and it's based on normal processes. It's not like certain psychopathological processes. If we can get rid of the crazies and institutionalize them, the problem is gone. This is something that affects normal people. And therefore, because it's rooted in normal processes, I want to alert you to the fact that it is extremely difficult to reverse this kind of process. So the task is very difficult. Second of all, I focused today only at the individual level, and that's because of time. I focused on what happens at the individual level. Modern racism occurs at the individual level, it occurs at the institutional level, it occurs at the level of society, it occurs at the level of the culture. So it occurs at many different levels. So if we're going to make any significant change in getting rid of it, that change has to occur at all these different levels. I just didn't have time to go into that. So the approach that I'm going to give you very briefly here is something that we've been developing called STEEP. Okay? See, the road is difficult, it's a steep road. It took me a long time to come up with an acronym that means something. I had to change some of the words. But STEEP really refers to different strategies. I just want to touch on these very briefly. The first step in this model is structural support. Research has shown that in industrial organizations, the critical factor in determining the success of equal opportunity in affirmative action programs is the perception that upper management, the senior administrators, support and unequivocally endorse these programs. It has to be clear and unequivocal that the top management will support these programs. We take our messages from the top. And if the top sends a clear message, we will listen. If it's anything but clear and unequivocal, these programs do not do well. A friend of mine, who was an assistant to the chief executive officer at Xerox, told me a story about the tremendous impact that structural support can have. What he did was he convinced the chief executive officer at a very important meeting of the senior administrative aides to just ask a simple question. The question was, hey, by the way, how are we doing with respect to equal opportunity in affirmative action? Now, actually, the chief executive officer had no idea what he was saying or why he was asking it, but he did ask that question. And it sent a ripple that was seen all the way through that particular company. Because what happened was the senior aides said, affirmative action, equal opportunity, I don't know. What they did was they went back and they were prepared for the next meeting. And they turned down to their subordinates and said, let's get working on this affirmative action stuff. And it sent that ripple all the way through. And there was a dramatic increase in improvement in those programs simply because the man on top said, I'm interested in this, that this is important to me. And people listen. It may not be for altruistic reasons, but who cares as long as the job gets done. So structural support is really essential. The second level here, I'll talk about training and education because they're virtually interchangeable. I've been talking about the subtlety of modern racism, how difficult it is to recognize, how easy it is to deny. It is essential, if we're going to make any change here, that people are trained to be sensitive to these issues, to be educated, so when they talk about racism, not simply to talk about the old-fashioned racism. So many people tell me, racism doesn't exist, I don't know any racists. But they're looking at the old-fashioned racism. So we have to train people to be sensitive to this issue, to educate people on this issue. Indeed, I see my presence here today as part of that educational process. Then comes experience. As I mentioned, anxiety is one of the factors that characterizes interracial experience. And it's through the repeated experience that this anxiety, which is a barrier to communication, will be broken down. In addition, one of the most pervasive findings in psychology is that the best way to reduce intergroup conflict is by structuring intergroup contact. It's very tricky. We have to structure it in very important ways, but by structuring intergroup contact, we can create more personalized responding and break down the we-they barrier. And in fact, one of the things you can do is you can get people to change, this is some of the research we're working on now, change the we-they classification. So it's no longer a black-white classification, but some other classification that's more inclusive. So experience is essential. We cannot eliminate bias in the abstract. It takes personal experience, it takes practice. And finally, personal commitment. Structural support, training, education, and experience all revolve around personal commitment. Because individuals are part of the problem, we must be part of the solution. What I try to argue today is that when we're confronted with an interracial situation, or when we make a decision involving a black person, or when we see racial disparities, one of the first things we do is come up with explanations that have nothing to do with race. And we dismiss the possibility that race may be a factor entirely. Later on in the question, I can give you some examples of these. What I'm asking you to do is to stop, to question those decisions. Not only the decisions you make, but the rationale behind those decisions. And think about the implications, the long-term implications these decisions have for you in your organization, your institution. And to be sensitive to the possibility, to recognize the fact that we might be biased. And then the next step is not simply to recognize bias, but then to take some personal commitment to do something about it. That we have to make the extra effort to make some change, to take some action, not only in ourselves, but in other people. I mean, remember Keith Genovese, when everybody thought that someone else would take action, no one did. And when everybody is responsible, often no one is responsible. So therefore, that's my bottom line, is that what I want to conclude by saying simply is that we have to not only recognize that bias exists, we don't have to recognize that bias exists just out there, but recognize that bias exists inside of us. And then what we have to do is to open ourselves, to make us open and vulnerable and look inside of us, to question ourselves very deeply, to stop saying we're good, fair, just, and egalitarian, and to do something about it that can make a significant difference, and personal commitment is the essential step. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reed. We appreciate your presence here, and we are going to take a break, and then you'll have a chance to dialogue and so forth with him back in here. But a few housekeeping announcements first. In this area, parking is rigidly enforced on the city streets. So if you're in an area that is a 2-hour limitation or a 1-hour limitation or along the meters, you may want to check your car or move them, something along that line. If you have any questions about that, or where you can go, there are a number of people from Augsburg around. And I'd just like to have them stand up so that you can see them. And if you have a question about parking or the location of something or where you can get a hold of them, you would know who to get in touch with. So would the Augsburg people please stand up so we know who you are. So they're around. Just ask. Also in the Foss Center parking lot, which is the lot behind the building, to the east of the building here, there's a red Mazda that has its lights on, 558 DGY. At this particular time, we're going to take a break of about 15 minutes. So you can be back in this room. There are washrooms down this hallway, and down that hallway, and down that hallway. So wherever you go.
Remember me, of course, because I'm not one of the people that you would remember, but we did strike a note of familiarity in that he noticed in his congregation last Sunday one of my very best friends, the present chancellor of the New York Public Schools, who is a graduate of Augsburg College. And of course, Reverend Proctor asked him to come forward. And he told him that he really appreciated the fact that since his mother and sister were in town, they brought him to church, and that he hadn't seen Richard at that church before. But I think that you'll find that this gentleman is a very, very sound person, well-rounded, and will provide a tremendous message for us. Dr. Samuel D Proctor is a native of Norfolk, Virginia. He attended Virginia State College in Virginia. I know that place well because it was very near the camp that I was stationed in when I was in service. He has a degree from graduate schools and from Virginia Union University, from theological seminaries, and has a graduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and also has attended the Harvard Institute for University Administration. His career as a minister began in a Baptist church in Providence, Rhode Island, and for 11 years he went back and served his alma mater, Virginia Union, as a teacher and a dean and as a president. And he was also president at North Carolina A&T at Greensboro. He has traveled extensively in more countries than I could name, even though they're right in front of me. And he presently is the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church of New York City. And he has also held the King Memorial Chair in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And upon his retirement from Rutgers, he was named the Martin Luther King Professor Emeritus and was awarded the Rutgers Medal of Distinguished Service. And so I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Samuel D Proctor.
I'm very grateful to Dr. Bowman for that generous introduction, and to President Anderson and the members of this committee responsible for calling us together and for inviting me to share this day with you. I have been inspired and informed by the comments and discussion of the panel at the lunch, and I hope that my remarks may add something to the day's deliberations. Add something in the sense that I come to you at the end of 45 years of service in education, the first half of which period was spent in the South in the black colleges where I taught and served as president in my own alma mater, so said, and then later at North Carolina A&T. And then, in between, I spent some 6 years in the federal service directing the Peace Corps in Nigeria, where all of our volunteers practically were in education, secondary or college education. And then in Washington, where I directed a program for our government called the Institute for Services to Education. So all of these years have been spent in higher education and largely in the preparation and training of teachers. At A&T College, I have a strong exception. One of my students was Reverend Jesse Jackson. He was the quarterback of my football team and the president of my Student Government Association. I would look a lot younger than I do if I hadn't had Jesse as the president of the Student Government Association. Incidentally, he really didn't play much football. I think he could, but he was so good looking he didn't want to get tackled. Every time they ran after him, he ran in the stands. I have a good time telling him about that these days. I'm going to speak with you now on higher education and moral accountability. At the heart of our culture here in America, there throbs and pulsates the notion that this nation, this society, celebrates the individual, the person. And the corollary is that each person must have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a kind of a global view of where we are, but in practice, we are in pursuit of that kind of a society that permits and encourages the enhancement of everyone's opportunity to that right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a free society, however, the options are very few in making good on this sublime promise. We don't have a dictatorship. We have no automatic process by which one is vaulted from a position of marginality to a position of inclusion. This has to happen in some institutional way, and education turns out to be the most effective means by which this takes place. Given the way human nature behaves, human nature, clinging to every known advantage, letting nothing happen to known advantages, guaranteeing that they are not jeopardized or threatened, or that nothing happens to them except to preserve or expand them. Human nature. Human nature being what it is, education turns out to be the most available and the most effective instrument, the most effective intervention for actualizing our guarantee of this life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it is no light matter when we make it difficult for people to negotiate the educational stream. Education is more than a gathering of cognitive outcomes. It is the pathway to emancipation. It's the pathway to reflective behavior. It means that we learn how to live above instinctive behavior, above glandular necessity, above neurological urges and demands, and we learn how to impose upon ourselves a value system. That's one of the outcomes of education. It has a kind of a humanizing consequence in our lives. It means we no longer live in the indicative mood. I came, I saw, I ate, I slept, I will go, I will come, I will eat. Beyond the imperative mood, go, come, sit down, shut up, Education allows persons to live in the subjunctive mood. I may go and I may not. I may say this, or upon closer reflection, I may not. Education enables me to canvass my options, to become aware of my margin of freedom, so that when all of the influences that control and constrain my life have been added up, education gives me veto power over them. And that's what makes it so dangerous. And that's why they did not want the slaves to be educated. And that's why a woman named Mrs. Douglas in my hometown of Norfolk, Virginia in 1856 was sent to jail for teaching a slave how to read. And that's why Frederick Douglass, working as a slave in Baltimore, living with a family who were Methodists, and when they went to the Methodist class meeting, Frederick Douglass was taught to read and write by a little white street urchin who would sneak into the kitchen through the back door to teach him how to read and write. And that's why Mary McLeod Bethune tells us that she had a book snatched out of her hands when she was a little girl because someone said, "That's not for you." Everyone has known the efficacy of an educated mind. And everyone has known how dangerous it is to allow persons to become educated if you intend to deny them freedom and options. This is what makes it such a terrible thing for colleges and universities to have an atmosphere that would be threatening for anyone seeking to have his or her mind enlightened. Right after the Civil War, the black minority celebrated this whole idea by voraciously going after education. When people comment today about the participation of blacks in education and make disparaging remarks about our interest in the cultivation of the mind, they show awful disregard for a period in our history when we had to build our own schools. when I was a boy, all of my teachers came from private secondary schools because there were no high schools provided for them at that time. My mother and father, living in Norfolk, Virginia, had no public high school available to them. Black people built secondary schools all over the Southland. In Virginia, I could stand here and name for you some 30 or 40 secondary schools established by Baptist associations. And when I was the president of Virginia Union, one of the things that I had to do was to fight for the buildings and the property of these schools as they were closing one by one. When public schools were provided, they were closing. And this valuable land was being taken by the counties, and we entered into suit to claim some of that land because it had been bought by Baptist people, and we were in the Baptist college. This is one of the most exciting periods in our history when black people, 4 million strong, coming out of slavery with no last names, no property, very few friends, made allies with the Methodists and the Catholics and the Lutherans and built schools and colleges all across the Southland, the Congregationists and the Presbyterians and all. And the United Negro College Fund schools today are the residual of that effort. Every one of those schools has its own history, background, but these schools began because black folk wanted education. My own college was founded in a jail. Black people couldn't find anybody to sell land or to rent a building, and old man Lumpkin had a jail for incorrigible slaves. And the Black Baptists got together, and the American Baptist Home Mission Society came down and helped them, and they bought Mr. Lumpkin's jail and turned the cells into classrooms and the whipping post into a lecture, and made the devil's half acre into a place of enlightenment. Black people have always honored the privilege of educating the mind. There's something curious about this. In 1867, 68, all of these schools were founded right after the Civil War, except Lincoln in Pennsylvania, founded in 1851, and Wilberforce in Ohio, founded in 1833. So around the period of 1967, 68, they were all having their centennials. All the pomp and the ceremony, the caps and gowns, all the parades, everybody celebrating 100 years. And I recall that I was in Washington at the time with the Peace Corps, and Vice President Humphrey had to go down to Clark College in Atlanta to speak for their centennial, and he had some problem and couldn't go. And I remember Bill Moyers called me up to say, Sam, the Vice President's supposed to be at Clark College today, and he can't go. And we've got an Air Force jet waiting for you. You've got to get a speech together and cap him down and zip down there. That's the way they did things in those days. And that was the Kennedy days, the shakers and the movers, And the next thing I knew, I was in a jet, boom, bam, right in Atlanta. Everybody standing around waiting for Vice President Humphrey. The police had their caps on and all the little knots, little bands and stuff, and all these flags, and the mayor with a big flower on them and everything like that. And then I stepped off the airplane. And he said, where's Vice President? What you see is what you get. You'd never believe it. But the next year, Lyndon B. Johnson was supposed to go down to Johnson C. Smith in Charlotte, North Carolina. These were all those black colleges founded at the same time. That was a Presbyterian school in Charlotte. Couldn't go. Same thing. I had to get myself ready in a minute. And Bill Morris said, you remember that speech you gave for Humphrey last year? Dust it off. You got to give the same talk. Landed down in Charlotte, they had a big excitement down there, and there I was again. So when I got back home, my wife said to me, wives can be so deflating. She said, what are you going to do with your fat jawed self now? I said, I'm going to sit by the telephone and wait for the Pope to call me. Tell me you can't make it to Notre Dame. These colleges went so far in the direction of trying to catch up as they proceeded that they went into the whole thing of European culture with a vengeance. The choirs sang music from Spain and Russia and Germany and all of that. Every program I've seen from that era, college choir concerts, had all of these European numbers, and then at the end they sang 3 black spirituals at the end as a kind of a token to their own culture. Greek letter fraternities and sororities were invented. Now, I'm one of them, and I'm financial, incidentally, and I'm not walking out on my fraternity. But can you imagine black people needing Greek letter fraternities and sororities at a time like that? You can explain it only in terms of black people trying to prove to everybody that they were just as capable of enjoying all the benefits of education that anyone else was capable of enjoying. Seems to me if they wanted to organize something, they would organize the daughters of Ruth, you know, or the brothers of Joseph, something with some symbolism that matched our condition. Greek letter, Alpha, Kappa, Alpha, Omega, Psi, Phi. All of that was our solicitous attitude trying to demonstrate our worthiness in this environment. It's pitiful sometimes to see how far we went to demonstrate our fitness, our preparation for higher education, and then to have the colleges and universities all across the Southland to tell us we could not even make an application. When I was a boy, I could not apply to the University of Virginia, to William and Mary, and even the Christian colleges, Hampton, Sydney, and Randolph-Macon, they were not allowed to accept my application. That's what we went through. Now, just as we were turned down when the Reconstruction period folded up, it seems to me that here we are at another watershed moment in our history. We set out in the 1860s to try to get started with education, and then when they shut down the Reconstruction and Hayes lost the election to Tilden, we began a period of about 50 years of hatred, resentment, trying to join labor unions. All of these things were rejected. Now, 100 years later, here we are like deja vu. We saw the Kennedy years and the Johnson years give us a thrust forward, and we thought we were on our way somewhere, and all of a sudden this hatred breaks out again. Some persons are today calling it new racism. The only reason why you can call it new racism is that you're so young. I'm old. I've seen it all the time. Now and then, it subsides, it's submerged, but every time blacks have made these strong thrusts forward, we discovered that we stirred up enemies, people who thought that we were coming after their known advantages. You know, that kind of xenophobia is terrible in our society. It's a part of the package of human nature, as I said earlier, and therefore something that transcends all of that has to become the agenda for higher education. And that's where I come in to argue that we've got an agenda problem. We're not celebrating anything in our schools and colleges anymore. I've got 3 sons hanging around my house. I wish you would take one of them from me. They won't move, they won't pay bills, they just like to go to school, and they think I enjoy having them go to school forever and forever and forever. They finish college, and they go after other degrees, and they hang around. But they don't even know the school song. They don't even know the alma mater. I say to them sometimes, you know, I know the alma mater of every school I ever attended. But we don't know the alma mater of anything. Why? Because schools don't celebrate anything. All of the pageantry is gone. We don't march anymore. We don't celebrate because we've got nothing to celebrate. We don't believe in anything enough to celebrate. When's the last time you've been to a celebration on a campus? Why, the juniors, the sophomores, and freshmen don't even go to a commencement exercise. The only commencement they attend is their own commencement. When we began colleges and universities in this land, we knew what we were all about. The colleges and universities began to guarantee that the clergy was well trained, and after that, the land grant movement to see to it that America became the breadbasket for the world and the economic giant among the nations. And these things have been accomplished. In Minnesota, you all know that well, with schools like St. Olaf and this college, and McAllister, schools that were strongly rooted in church traditions. And then your great land-grant university, you have excelled them all. But you see, these schools have had clear purposes, and everybody knows what the purposes were. By now, our colleges and universities have nothing that causes people to have chill bumps to pop out, nothing that causes us to stand still and let the tears flow. We don't get emotional about anything. What are we here for? To learn how to make money, quick, fast, and more of it. We need an agenda. And when you start talking about idealistic things such as having a sense of community and getting rid of racism, you're in the wrong atmosphere to think idealistic thoughts like that. These sublime notions do not thrive in the midst of crass materialism. Everybody's heart is sold to money. That's not the atmosphere to be getting rid of these instinctive and survival modes of behavior. It's a moral issue. It's a moral issue. Education is here for the humanization of persons, and when universities make this difficult, it's morally wrong. The leaders in education ought to be terribly concerned that we do not have a clear agenda, why we are here together, why we grant tenure to anybody, tenure for what, to do what, to hang around with what on your mind. It's time to look at this. Education should be proud to celebrate the fact that we have 250 million Americans, and we want all of them to be educated as we possibly can do it. And we ought to be trying to celebrate the fact that we've got free universities. No Duke, no Dow, and no dictator tells us what to teach. Teach whatever your conscience tells you to be. This ought to be the most exciting thing in the world, to have a chance to be free to spread knowledge. And here we are talking about more elitism, more ways of excluding people. I saw a professor on our campus walking around there. What are you teaching this year? Sam, I don't teach a damn soul this year. He wished he had a school with no students at all. Not on his mind. Well, if we were going to try to recover some of this and put it in place, you would find out that this issue of racism would become a small matter in the midst of a much larger quest. And when I say quest, I mean, first of all, professional competence among faculty and administrators. Professional competence that includes the capacity to know the clients who are to be served. Imagine professionals who do not know the clients who are to be served. And how do you acquire this? Well, you've got to learn how to be vicarious. You've got to learn how to stand in another person's place. That's what education does for us. And those who are professionals in education ought to know how to do this excellently. We ought to learn how to come out of our own bio-data and enter into the bio-data of the client to be served. That ought to be the sine qua non of professionalism in education. You ought not to be shocked when an American Indian walks in. You ought not be shocked when a Chicano comes in, when a blind student comes in, a student in a wheelchair. You ought to stay poised and learn how to come out of your middle-class preoccupation and enter into the status of the person you're trying to teach. Mark Hopkins on one end of a log and a student on the other, and ought not to be strangers one to another. Vicariousness. Look at the days I've spent in class embarrassed because a white professor would stop the whole lecture and ask me, Sam, what did the colored think about that? He's the professor. I went to a conference in Augsburg in Austria one summer, where we were supposed to help Europeans to understand our problems in higher education over here. And at night, the American professors all gathered together late at night and talked about our problems here. And in that atmosphere, being the only black person there, and God knows what we've gone through, and we were the only blacks around, they would ask me the dumbest questions in the world. And you know, they were presidents of big universities. Nobody from Minnesota, by the way. Presidents of big universities with great names would ask me the stupidest questions about black people. And one of them said to me this, he said, Sam, I always wanted to ask somebody black. This man's president of a school with 35 or 40,000 students. He says, why can't all black people do what you and your brothers have done? I said, what do you mean? He said, we've been talking. You've got a brother who's a dentist, and one's a surgeon, and sister who's been a retired teacher, and here you are, college president. Why can't all black people do that? I said, why can't all white people do that? You must be out of your mind. I said, what we've done is rare. And you don't mean why can't all black people do it? What are you talking about? You would never believe that this happened to me. I went to a bowling alley with my son. He's good. He was a Central Jersey champion. He loved bowling. He was left-handed. I think he was afflicted so that the bowling ball couldn't go anywhere else in his arms. Something the matter with that boy. The way he could make strikes, you know, was just unnatural. A professor from our university came in and sat right down beside me. Now, if you know about a bowling alley, you gotta sit two at a table, you know, two little stools right there in one table. You gotta divide it. He turned his back to me. He had been in the University Senate with me for 6 years. And I was the only black somebody in the Senate. He couldn't have missed me. He knew. His boy was learning how to bowl, and he was throwing the ball in the gutter every time. I said to my Sam, I said, this dude won't even turn around and speak to me, but don't hold the boy responsible. If you get his eye, tell him to show him how to throw that ball. He said, I will if he'll look at me. He said, but he won't look at me either. He did that for about an hour and a half, and my Sam was here just warming up, you know, just making these strikes, one bam, bam, bam. It was embarrassing. But neither one of them looked over here to say, hey, how do you do that? You know, they wouldn't. Now, he got up, it had been stolen. He put on his galoshes, his boots, and all wrapped up. Then he touched me after an hour and a half. He said, I want to congratulate you. I said, well, thank you. For what? Congratulate you and your son for being in this bowling alley and not smoking cigarettes or using profanity. I declare that's what he said. Every time I repeat that, I just can't believe it. That's what he said. This man is a tenured professor, long-time professor in our university, in one of the most popular departments there, and that's the way he behaves in the presence of a black person. Incredible. Incredible. Well, those of us who've had to live it out, have had all of these things to contend with. And the thing that shocks us is that in colleges and universities, there are so many persons who have not completed their own social development and have not developed that kind of professionalism that educated people ought to possess. And I think that to teach in the high school, elementary school, anywhere, the first prerequisite ought to be that one would have the professional competence to learn the clients who are to be served. I don't think it's too much to ask college professors who are going to serve minority students, too much to ask them to know about the students and the culture and the background. You know, when they began the experimental Seek up at City College, an article was written about the way the professors talked about the Puerto Rican and black students who came. You see, they didn't know who these people were, but the television cameramen were around and they were listening to the professors talk. The article in one of our magazines in New York, it was shameful. Professors walking up and down the hallway, smoking their pipes, you know, and commenting to each other. News people listening, calling this a zoo, talking in the most disparaging terms about young blacks and Puerto Ricans coming to a public college trying to enlighten themselves, trying to go to school. Well, what kind of professional competence is that to try to insult them and drive them out? So before we even get to the issue of racism on our campuses, we're talking about simple competence of people. Listen, for me to be competent in my field, I have to know all about the Hellenic world, Alexander the Great, all about his generals and how they divided up the world, all about Antiochus Epiphanes. My name is not Antiochus. I didn't ever live over there. But to be competent in my field, I've got to learn how to walk around the rim of the Aegean and the Adriatic. I've got to know the Mesopotamian basin like the back of my hand to be competent in my field. I couldn't get away with that. I didn't live in England in the 1600s, but I know more about England in the 1600s than I know about any other place. 1607, Jamestown colony founded, huh? 1611, the King James Bible written. 1619, the blacks brought to Jamestown a whole year before George Bush and the Pilgrims got here. 1644, Charles I has his head cut off, and then John Locke's treatise on government written at the end of the century. I know the 1600s in England. I have to know it in order to be competent in my field in philosophy and in ethics and theology. Now, why is it that somebody teaching urban students in America can't pause and understand the background of black people in this country, 1/10 of the population, and learn the background and history of the American Indian population and the Hispanic population? That's a professional requirement. Come next and see that if people are honest about it, they'll want to share more freely the fund of knowledge. If you're a teacher, you want to teach. You don't want to start driving people out of your classroom because they're fat or thin or tubercular or whatever. You want people to be taught. When I was in college, I think I had about 6 professors who understood this, and they educated me. I didn't pay any attention to the rest of those people who didn't know why they were there. Those who demonstrated to me that they wanted me to learn became my friends for life. Who is this professor who does not want to teach people, who wants to create an atmosphere by which black people, 247 years of slavery and dehumanization, now trying to improve and change their status, trying to participate fully, and here's somebody who migrated here from someone else himself, somewhere else himself, trying to embarrass young black students. That's moral failure, I tell you. That's moral failure. We ought to want to share more freely the fund of knowledge. If you know it, you ought to help somebody else to find it out. We should not enjoy seeing an underclass develop in this country. Every time we read bad news about jails overcrowding, bad news about rape, murder, crime, or what have you, compare that to the atmosphere on some of our campuses where the professors make it so difficult for young blacks to enter and to find their initiation into the life of the mind and into the world of ideas, making it so difficult. It's moral failure. I taught in colleges where we had students who were not always the best prepared. And what did we do with these people? All of these programs we have today, we didn't have then. All we had to count on was the vicariousness of the professors and their eagerness to induct young people into the life of the mind. I did not want to lose a single one of them. I'll never forget our old basketball player. We called him Mouse because he was small. In those days, we just called him what you looked like. He was small, we called him Mouse. He was going home because he couldn't pass the English comprehensive examination. Mouse, you can't go home. Doc, I gotta go. Dean Henderson said, I flunked it 3 times, I gotta go. Let me talk with the dean and see if I can get you a break on this. But I want to tutor you, Mouse. Here I am, the president, with a blue striped suit and a violet tie, and I'm going to take him in my basement on my ping-pong table, and I'm going to teach this dude English enough to pass the test. He said, Doc, it's a lot of it I don't know. I can't teach you all of it, but tell me the hard part, and let's work on that. He said, the hard part is what they call the predicate nominative. I said, that's not hard, that's easy, man. Come on, Doc, Bob, you play ping-pong. Bob, I said, what is it about it you can understand? Bob, all that, it is I. Bam, we are they. Bam, this is she. Bam, I said, put that thing down, let's get to work. You don't understand the predicate now. I said, now, Mouse, you're from Brooklyn. Yeah, Bedford-Stuyvesant. We don't talk like that up there. I said, Mouse, let me ask you something. Did I ever hear you say throw the ball to I? No, I don't talk like that. What do you say, Mouse? Throw the ball to me. See, you know. But I need a rule. Wait a minute. We'll get to the rule. Did I ever hear you say we beat they last night? No, what do you say? We beat them last night. Sure you do. See, you can pass that test. But Doc, you gotta give me a rule. I said, you hold still, look me straight in the eye, and give you a rule. I didn't have a rule when I said that. But I believed that if I wanted him to have a rule, that would be enough. See, I'm a theologian. The Lord would give me a rule. I'd get a rule from somewhere. Existentially, I'd get a rule. I said, Mouse, let me tell you something. There are only 2 kinds of people in the whole world with respect to grammar. Only 2, yeah. In grammar, we only deal with 2 kinds of people. Those who do and those who are done unto. And those who do are in the nominative case. Those who are done unto in the objective case. And you know who they are. All those who've been done unto, they're in the M crowd. They're been done unto. Whom been done unto. Him been done unto. Me been done unto. He said, what about whomever? Whomever has been done unto, we just don't know his name yet, that's all. Yeah, what about whoever? I said, whoever did it, we don't know his name yet either. He said, well, what is a predicate nominative? I said, don't use that profanity around me. That's when nothing has happened to anybody. It is I. Did anything happen to I? No. Well, leave I like I is. Don't bother I. It is I. Will they? Did anything happen to they? No. Well, leave they like they are. Don't bother they. He said, is that all there is to that? I said, try it a few times. He didn't miss one time. He said, Doc, why don't they teach it to us like that? He says, I've been in school now for about 16 years and you taught me this in 16 minutes and I've been funneling this thing all of my life. Well, why don't they teach it to you? It's because you've got to be vicarious enough to come out of your PhD and enter into the world of a kid right from the streets of Bedford-Stuyvesant. And if you're really secure in your PhD, you know you're not going to lose anything by visiting his world of Bedford-Stuyvesant. And if you care enough about him, you'll be willing and happy to come out of your biodata and enter into his biodata and look at the world from where he stands. Then will come the analogies and the similes and the metaphors and all the for instances that you need to help somebody else to be inducted into the life of the mind. Oh, what a sacred thing it is to reach out for youngsters who come in from poverty and isolation and violence and noise and dirt and say to them, come over here and we're going to emancipate you and show you your margin of freedom. Then you can do whatever you want to do with your life. That's a whole lot better than filling up the prisons. This is a moral issue. And we're losing fast because we don't have the commitment on the part of the people. Before we start talking about racism, We're talking about professional competence. You just aren't competent, in my view, if you can't teach someone from Asia, someone from the other side of the track. You can teach only people who look like you, whose eyes are your color. That's a limited access. And then you've got to be zealous about sharing knowledge with people who are eager to learn. What a shame it is to see colleges and universities looking for more subtle ways of excluding people when we ought to be trying to broaden the portal and trying to prepare our teachers to induct the new initiates into the life of the mind. It ought to be something to celebrate. Finally, we ought to want to affirm the principle of justice and fairness. You see, we've been riding and cruising on the ethics of John Stuart Mill and Charles Darwin in this country for a long, long time. These 19th century ideas were designed to give support to all kinds of colonialism and all kinds of domination, keeping women down, keeping the poor down, fighting all kinds of people trying to rise. It sounds so sacred. Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, who's going to tell us what the greatest good is? You know who's going to tell you that. The greatest number, of course. Those with the power are going to tell you what the greatest good is. Can't we find a definition of the greatest good that the greatest number would be willing to accept? No, the greatest number will tell you what the greatest good is. You see how it sounds so innocent in the beginning? The greatest good for the greatest number, and then beg the question, what is the greatest good? Slavery, is that the greatest good? Second-class status for women, is that the greatest good? Well, that's what they all accepted. And then Darwin, the survival of the fittest, making it appear in social terms that those of us who are not doing so well are not doing so well because we are not fit to do better. No allowances for deliberate, designed, discriminatory treatment to make us feel like dirt. No allowance for that. Just those who have ought to have, and everyone has what he deserves in life. Well, everybody does not have what he or she deserves in life. You know it, I know it. I don't have what I deserve. I've got so much more than I deserve. I had a grandmother right out of slavery to be sent to Hampton Institute. What could I do to deserve a grandmother like that? All of my young years in my home, there was my grandmother forbidding me to spit of her, forbidding me to spit the infinitive form of her, not allowing me to have a pronoun out of line with its antecedent. A grandmother who knew the Psalms and the Sermon on the Mount by memory, and Paul's 13th chapter, 1 Corinthians, and who knew Thanatopsis and In Memoriam and Longfellow's Psalm of Life and Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry. I grew up around a grandmother who played the piano and made me play my clarinet beside her. What did I do to deserve that? And up and down the street, there were fellows with grandmothers who couldn't read and write. Oh, we don't all have what we deserve in life. Some of us have a lot more than what we deserve in life. I had a daddy who made boats for us, made bicycles out of cannibalized bicycle parts, taught us how to use tools and how to write and draw and paint. Oh, what a Renaissance man he was. Sang tenor in the choir, played the violin and the piano. My daddy would embarrass you at anything you tried to do. Swim, play baseball, he could beat us doing anything. What did I do to deserve a daddy like that? If there weren't but 3 people in the church, my daddy would be there with 2 of his boys. I've got far more than I deserve in life. And in Harlem, I'm driving around the streets all the time watching children who don't have what they deserve in life. Filth and dirt and violence and drugs. They don't have what they deserve in life. So, those of us who obviously have more than what we deserve should then help those who have less than what they deserve to have an equal opportunity for equal outcomes and do all that we can. That's what makes it so immoral for professors and administrators to allow racism to flourish on the campus, because it's unfair to impede people who have inherited less than what they deserve to have a chance to elevate and to have an equal opportunity for equal outcomes. You can't give anybody equal outcomes. You can't hand diplomas around people's necks who did not deserve them, but you surely can try to provide the atmosphere in which they may have an equal opportunity for equal outcomes. Now, some of you who read philosophy, some of you who read philosophy will recognize that that's the thought of John Rawls. It's the thought of John Rawls, but it's the thought also of the prophet Micah. What does the Lord require of thee but to do justly and to love mercy, to walk humbly with God? It's Jesus, as you would, that men should do unto you, to be likewise unto them. It's Immanuel Kant in the categorical imperative. You behave in such a way that if everybody acted the way you act, everything would be all right. Yes, Rawls wrote it. Took him 480 pages to say it. But we've been knowing it all the time. That not everybody has what he deserves. Let me close by telling you this, a little personal thing. I'm very happy about the way my boys behave. It gives me a fit. They spend all my money and that sort of thing. But these dudes, they do well. The oldest one is a social worker in a tough school district in Orange, New Jersey. The younger one, well, he didn't leave home to do good. He left home to do well. He's a lawyer for a big corporation over there in New York. When they were young, right out of graduate school, I remember they came to me one day, Pop, we want to borrow $1,500. I said, all right. That's the social worker. The social workers, they're poor all the time, poor. I want to borrow $1,500. Then the lawyer said, Pop, how about letting me have $1,500? It's funny, you guys got the same nice round number in mind, both of you, $1,500 each. So we were sitting there talking, and I said, social worker, what do you need $1,500 for? Daddy, I've got a job down in Beaufort, South Carolina, making $9,000 a year. Now, this is about 10, 15 years ago. And I've got a better job making 18 in Alexander, Virginia. You do need money back. You need to change back. And what are you going to do with the money if I get it for you? I need $500 for the moving man. I need $500 for my pay, until they get my name straight in the computer. And I need $500 to put down on the apartment. Oh, you need $1,500 back. Write that. Let me write that down. $1,500. Barrister, what do you need $1,500 for? With that, I'm single now. I don't need the same thing that Urban needs. You got a wife and children. But Daddy, I'm in New York, and I've got a big apartment now in the Palisades looking over the New York skyline. The girls who come by my place like to run around barefooted, so I need some carpeting on my floor. And I need some artwork that come from good families, all went to Wells and Vassar, places like that. I need some reproductions around my wall. I need $500 for that. And I make the place look exciting. And then I need my sound system, my beepers and creepers, and hoofers and woofers. I got to get the sound system fixed up. Now, here's a lawyer who makes 3 times what the social worker makes. Huh? The lawyer went to college 4 years, then he came out here to Chicago, 4 more years with an MBA and a law degree, left me broke, limp, nothing. Social worker went to cheap college in the South, then went to state college. I spent 7, 8 times as much for this lawyer as I spent on him, and he's going to make that much more than the social worker. They both want $1,500 each. Huh? There are people who say, Sam, you love them both, give them both $750 a piece. Call that justice. But that's not all about these dollars. The social worker was born with a hole between the ventricular wall, ventricular septal defect, a hole, so that the spent blood from the body never got to the lungs in proper quantity, so he was a blue baby. Lips were purple, fingernails purple, walked wide-legged, never could play ball, couldn't dance, couldn't swim. Nobody ever invited him to a birthday party. He lived a very defensive life in all of his young years. I used to have to carry him on my shoulder like a sack of potatoes. And he always wondered why his brother, the lawyer, was so good-looking and bright and aggressive, could take on tough challenges. He took a much safer route, but he got there. He's doing fine. He had an operation down at Johns Hopkins in 1960 that straightened out Dr. Blaylock, and Towson went in and built a wall between his ventricles. And now he's got a normal life expectancy. Here he's sitting there telling me he needs $1,500 to move from a $9,000 job to an $18,000 job. Needs money for milk and shoes, wife and 2 kids. There's a single lawyer here who went to Yale, went to Chicago, got everything past the New York bar the first time he took it. Telephone jumps off the hook on his way to something big. He needs $1,500 also. Here's a boy born with an impediment he didn't ask for, didn't deserve. He did nothing to cause himself to come here with a hole between the ventricles. Wouldn't you think that everybody who has a PhD degree could understand this analogy that I'm making? Wouldn't you think any professor, any dean, anywhere in any college ought to understand these things? Some people in this society are living out undeserved impediments imposed upon them. Wrong. And some people have a whole lot more than what they deserve. Now, what ought we to do? We ought to do what I did. We ought to fix it so that this fella has an improved opportunity for equal outcomes with this one. So what did I do? I didn't abandon $1,500. I took the last $1,500 I could find and I gave it to him with God's speed. And to this one, I gave him the telephone number of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Thank you, and God bless you.
I had the privilege of opening and now closing this particular date. There's no way that one could adequately summarize, I think, what we've heard and said and done today. I will not attempt to do that, but rather invite you to think about how we might proceed into the future. On a very simple level, you can help the committee move ahead by filling in the evaluation form, especially if the recommendations were followed. I hope you will all do that. Either leave it or mail it to the address that's given. You can help all of us develop a network for activists by filling in the pink sheet. You need not buy the tapes, by the way, to fill in the pink sheet. They're given at cost, as I understand it, but the important thing is that you should indicate your wish to have follow-up mailings. This will be important information for those of us who are working and will continue to work on the advisory committee. I think that we are all interested in system change. As Bob Carruthers laid out, we're interested in increasing personal awareness and change, as Dr. Dovidio laid out. I think we're all hopeful of engendering actions that show personal commitment and the perseverance and the competence that Dr. Proctor described. But the question is now, what will we do at home? I intend to have a conference or a series of meetings for faculty and staff at this school that will be based on our discussions today. I'm already being pressed by some of our faculty that were here to have a regional conference on the subject next year. And we will do that if we can find some modest financial support. It's not in the budget as yet. Footnote, this meeting has been underwritten in part by a grant from the Minnesota Private College Fund, Kellogg Foundation money that they administer. What I see for Augsburg are very small steps, and as you drive home, please consider what could be done on your campus. Plan it. If you are in a position of authority and have control over a budget, you can go ahead and plan it. If you are a student, you can scheme about it, because you're not in a position of authority and don't have a budget, but you can affect change. I think as we read the newspapers and listen to each other, we recognize that there is so much to do that some people that I know are inclined to throw up their hands and withdraw from the fray. I happen to be a Star Trek fan, and Mr. Spock, in one of the old Star Trek episodes, has a beautiful line for these people. You might remember it. Captain Kirk, in this instance in the story, has been zapped away from the bridge of the Enterprise, and no one knows where he is. He's been hauled off into space, and everyone is dismayed. They don't know what to do, and Mr. Spock is now in command, and he instructs the crew to start checking every quadrant, everything, because in the story there is some trail, some residue that would have been left behind as someone is hauled off 1,000,000 miles into space. Lieutenant Sulu responded. He said, the possibilities in a search like this are infinite. It will take absolutely forever. To which Spock responds, in that case, Lieutenant, I suggest that you begin immediately. An almost classic statement. We are not really beginners, but there is a long way to go, and today I think has been a good beginning to that longer journey. And we're all ready to close now. I was trying to think of some way to do this. St. Paul, in one of his letters, exhorts the believers to greet one another with a holy kiss. Well, in these days of colds like mine and flu and the constant threat of claims of sexual harassment, I think we will not follow that advice. But at the very least, as we think about our speakers and panelists and discussion leaders, I think we should applaud them and each other in thanks for a good day. We'll do that. We're grateful that you came. I hope we can do something like this again, and I hope you travel home safely. Thank you very much.